Hans Niemann, you dog, sacrificing not just one bishop, but two bishops back to back in the game of the year in his recent one-on-one blitz match versus Anish Giri that happened today on June 4th, 2025. But let's go back to the very beginning of this game of the year. Hans Niemann opening 1e4, best by test, and Anish Giri 1e5. Now we have knight f3, knight c6, and normally here Hans Niemann does go bishop c4, the Italian opening, but instead in this game Hans going bishop b5, the Ruy Lopez opening, an interesting wrinkle in this game. Now here, black has a lot of ideas. a6 and knight to f6 are the main lines here for black. And in the game, black does go a6, the good old-fashioned Morphy's defense, putting the question to the bishop. Where do you want to go? Do you take on c6 or go back? In the game, white goes back to a4. Then we have knight f6, threatening e4, white castles, tactically defending the pawn on e4, and now black here goes for sort of a little sideline, the move d6. Now, the idea behind this move is very simple. Black here supports the pawn on e5, therefore eliminating any sort of taking on c6, then e5 threat from white. Beyond that, black likely intends bishop d7, although bishop g4 is also possible, and from there, black can go either bishop to e7 or even g6, bishop g7. Black has a lot of different ideas from here, but of course, white's main idea, white's main way to fight for an edge in this position is going to be some combination of rook e1, c3, and d4. All right, from here, Hans. c3 is the move, and black does go bishop d7, controlling this diagonal and trying to blunt white's bishop on this diagonal right here. Now Hans goes rook e1, finally defending e4, and black, sure enough, does go g6. Black is heading for essentially a King's Indian style pawn structure here, with the pawns on c7, d6, e5, and then also g6 and so on. All right, now Hans, unfazed. d4 is the move, gaining space in the center. Black goes bishop g7. Hans goes h3, guarding g4, therefore stopping any sort of future bishop g4 idea from black. Not a bad move at all. Or sorry, not a bad move from white at all. A very prudent idea. Now here, black castles. White goes bishop c2, retreating the bishop. Black goes rook to e8, a good square for the rook, setting up some pressure on the pawn on the e4 square. For example, if black ever takes on d4, then the rook will be lined up with the pawn on the e4 square. And now Hans, knight bd2, the standard square for that knight, defending e4. And both sides here have played pretty much all of the most obvious moves so far in this game. And really, the middle game has just about begun. Now, both sides have not quite completed development, but it's essentially the middle game at this point in the game. Now, what are the plans for both sides? Well, Hans Niemann here, obviously, he has that very strong pawn center here. Therefore, his main objective is to further control the center, maybe threaten d5 later in the game, and to find a good square for this knight. It may go to, for example, g3, and white may even expand on the queen side with moves like b4 and a4. White has a lot of different ideas here. Now, black, what is black's idea? Well, Anish Giri, this guy prepped this line specifically for this one-on-one match because he finds the absolute strongest idea for black, and it's a very trendy idea in general at the Super GM level. He plays the move a5. Now, this may look a little bit strange. After all, black went a6 earlier in the opening and then goes a5. What is the idea behind this move? Well, you know what? Let's just wait a couple of moves. It will reveal itself. Here, Hans has many ideas. For example, you can expand in the center. You can expand on the queen side with, say, a3 or b3 or a4. Or you can go knight to f1 as Hans did in the game. Knight f1 is a very logical idea. You're just intending knight g3. And overall, g3 is a fantastic square for this knight in this opening. But here, Anish shows the real idea behind a5. He actually goes a4. This is a very creative idea, and at the Super GM level these days, it seems like the only thing white and black know how to do is push these rook pawns down the board like this. Now, this move, first of all, it does gain control of the a4 square. Now the rook on the a8 square does control it, and black stops any sort of bishop a4 ideas in the future. Beyond that, black also likely intends b5 and maybe even b4 later, or maybe even a3. So black, with the very solid pawn structure in the center, is now seeking counterplay on the queen side, which turns out to be very, very playable for black. Now Hans, knight g3 is the move. We have b5 for black. And here Hans decides, you know what, with black expanding on the queen side, the best I can do here is just continue to develop and consolidate in the center. So Hans finds a very simple way to continue developing. That is bishop e3, then queen d2, and then rook a d1. So Hans going for absolute, complete centralization of all of his pieces. So we have bishop e3, then h6, then queen d2. Hans here targeting h6. Anish Giri is going to have to respond. He goes king to h7, the typical idea here, and then Hans rook a d1. So Hans Niemann here has achieved literally full centralization of all of his pieces, and now he has to find a plan. There's no way to further, centralize things. You can't bring the rooks any closer to the center. They're already on e1 and d1, so Hans has to find a plan here. Now, Anish Giri, what is he going to do? Now, this plan with a5, a4, and then b5, it's effective, but he has to find a good follow-up, and it's not really obvious what Black's plan is. In the game, Anish Giri, queen to c8 is the move. Now, this move has at least a couple of ideas. First of all, the queen is eyeing b7. Black may want to go queen b7, intending b4, getting counterplay on the queen side. That is certainly one idea. But beyond that, of course, you can't forget Black is technically sort of threatening the bishop sacrifice on the h3 square with the light squared bishop. Of course, right now, it's not the most dangerous thing ever. If you take on h3, White basically gets the piece for free, but that could be a threat later in the game. Now, Hans, bishop d3 is the move, a typical idea in many closed Ruy Lopez openings. For example, the Shigorin variation. This is a very common idea, targeting b5 right here with the bishop, and White may even go queen to e2 as well, further increasing the pressure on that pawn. Now here, Black has to find the right idea. In the game, Anish goes queen b7, defending b5 with the queen immediately, a very logical choice. But instead, it turns out the move knight to a5 might be a little bit stronger. The point being, the bishop on d7 then defends b5, and from there, Black can also flirt with ideas like, for example, a3 or b4 or c5 or knight c4. Overall, knight to a4 gives Black a little bit more options on the queen side. Instead, queen to b7 played in the game, defending b5, not a bad move at all. But here, Hans Niemann, he starts to shark around a little bit, and he finds an interesting idea. Rook to b1. Hans sliding his rook from a1 to d1, and then from d1 back to the b1 square. What is the idea? Well, obviously, the rook here, it lines up with the queen on b7. That is almost always a good idea in chess, to line your rook up with the queen like that. And beyond that, White may be intending b3, and then b takes a5, trying to open up the b file. So Hans, he's achieved complete dominance in the center. He doesn't want to go d5 yet, and therefore, the next best idea is to open up the b file. Now here, Anish, rook a d8 is the move, centralizing this rook, and now his rooks are very well placed on d8 and e8, but his queen on b7, it sort of risks being locked out of the game, and that will be especially true if White gets the attack going on the king side against the Black king. Now here, Hans, as promised, b3 is the move, trying to open up the b file. The threat now is b takes a4, at which point Black cannot take back with the b pawn, as then he would lose the queen on b7. You obviously can't allow that. So what does Black do? He takes on b3, a takes b3, and here Hans takes back with the a pawn as well. A takes b3. But I do want to point out, this was a very good time for the intermediate move, d5, driving back that knight and then taking on b3 with the rook. According to Stockfish, that is by far the strongest idea here for White, and White would get a huge initiative in the center and on the queen side with that sequence. Instead, a takes was played in the game, and here Black does go b4, gaining space and trying to sort of chop up White's pawn structure on the queen side. Of course, if you take on b4, then White has these very ugly doubled pawns on the queen side. On the other hand, if you go c4, then Black can take on d4 as that pawn is now weakened. So Anish finding a simple way to try and chop up and slice and dice White's pawns here in the center and on the queen side. Now Hans, he goes d5 here, gaining space, a typical Ruy Lopez idea, and Black, instead of moving the knight immediately, he instead plays the intermezzo move b takes c3, attacking the queen before moving the knight. And the benefit of this is, of course, Black gets an additional useful move in before having to play defensively. Now, White takes on c3, queen takes, and then black goes knight b4, jumping in and threatening the bishop on d3. That would be, overall, I'd say a pretty good trade for Anish Giri if he could knock off that bishop. That bishop, of course, is a very important attacking piece here. If white wants to attack the black king later in the game, he really needs to keep that Ruy Lopez bishop alive. All right, Hans, bishop c4 is the move, and Anish goes c6, chopping down at the front of the pawn chain, a typical idea in the French defense, the Ruy Lopez opening, and so on. And here white takes on c6, and black takes back with the bishop. Now, from here, the center of the board is really starting to open up. The big feature here, of course, is that gaping hole on d5. Here, in an ideal world, white would get some sort of piece there, ideally a knight, but both of these knights are very far away from that square. And beyond that, black, I mean, almost every single black piece here controls d5. I mean, literally like 1, 2, 3, 4 pieces, 5 pieces potentially control d5. Therefore, black is very well positioned for a future d5 break. And beyond that, black also has tremendous pressure on the pawn on e4. Now, don't get me wrong, white is also doing very, very well here. His pawn on e4 is still good. His knights are good. His 2 Bs are quite good as well. So Hans is still certainly in the game. And it's really, really a crazy position where both sides have achieved pretty much exactly what they wanted out of the opening. So now it's just a big battle of their competing plans here. All right, Hans, rook to a1, trying to activate the rook on the open a file. And of course, he is seeing rook to a7 ideas slicing along the 7th rank. So here, black does go d5. Anish Giri finding the critical idea here. I mean, everything about his position is just begging black to play this key d5 break right here, blowing open the game. Of course, the drawback of this move, the pawn on e5, is now technically hanging. White has 1, 2 pieces attacking it. However, overall, the complications are good for black, and this certainly was the best move. Now, Hans, he is not slowing down. He does not take on d5. Oh no. Instead, he plays the intermezzo move, rook to a7, attacking the queen, and the rook is now slicing across the 7th rank against the pawn, the bishop, and the king via the X-ray attack. Now here, we have queen to b8. The queen steps out of the attack, and of course here, Hans, his bishop on c4 is under attack. And you might think, all right, he's going to move the bishop back to, say, I don't know, e2 or f1. Or somewhere else, anywhere where it's safe. But no, Hans Niemann, this guy is essentially a caveman at the chessboard. This guy plays very intuitively. He likes to put maximum pressure on the opponent, even if the moves aren't necessarily the strongest. And here, he actually finds a very, very strong double bishop sacrifice. He takes on f7 with the rook, winning the pawn, but giving up the bishop on c4. And black here, what can he do? He pretty much has to take on c4. Anish Giri is all in here. D takes c4 is the move. But now Hans, the second bishop sacrifice. Bishop takes h6. Hans Niemann literally playing a double back-to-back bishop sacrifice. What is the idea? Well, here, the bishop on h6, it's poisoned. You can't take it. First of all, you legally can't take it with the bishop, as then the king would be under check. But instead, if you take with the king, you are going to fall under a ferocious attack. You don't want to do that. Now, the best move here for black is simply rook d7, trying to chop off this very, very active piece for white. And from there, the lines are super complicated. White takes on g7, black takes back, white takes, black takes, and then b takes c4. And in the endgame, Hans Niemann would have decent chances. Now, going back, way back to this position here, Anish Giri, he does not heed my warning. He takes on h6 with the king, and as you can see by the eval bar skyrocketing on the left, here Hans Niemann should be completely winning if, and I mean if, he can find all of the right moves here. He starts queen to e3, hitting the king on h6, a good move, driving that king back. The king goes back to the h7 square. Then knight to f5, the knight jumps in, and of course, first of all, white here threatening rook takes g7. That would be deadly. And beyond that, of course, if you take on f5 with the g-pawn like that, then white's going to have various ways to continue the attack. But it turns out here, Anish Giri, he takes the sacrifice piece, the third sacrifice piece. Hans Niemann, he's down to one minor piece versus the 1, 2, 3, 4 minor pieces of Anish Giri. Hans playing a triple minor piece sacrifice, and so far, according to the engine, it is completely justified, completely correct. The move now is queen to g5, threatening checkmate in one move. The audacity. What is Anish Giri going to do to defend against the threat? In the game, rook to g8 is the move. It's the only move. It defends g7, and now what is the follow-up for Hans Niemann? Well, here, the simple move. You just take the knight. Of course, the bishop on g7 is pinned to the king. So queen takes is the obvious way to continue. But here, Hans, he doesn't do that. Instead, he takes on f5, opting to continue the triple piece sacrifice. But this move right here is a massive mistake, and Anish Giri is suddenly back in the game. He goes back, king to h8. This is the important part. The knight on f6. It cannot be taken as black just takes back, and black is doing okay. So what should Hans do here? It turns out the only way to continue the attack is knight to g5. That is the only way. Threatening ideas like rook takes, bishop takes, and then queen to h7 would be checkmate if Hans had an extra move. The lines there are very complicated. White goes knight g5, black goes rook d7, and from there, it's a very complicated fight. Now, instead, Hans Niemann, he messes it up. He chokes. Knight takes e5. Another blunder. Back-to-back blunders for Hans Niemann. First, taking on f5 with the queen instead of on f6. And then, after king to h8, he takes on e5 with the knight. Hans, what are you doing? The problem here, black. He plays the queen sacrifice. Queen takes e5, a brilliant move. What is the idea? Here, Hans, he takes on e5 with the queen, and then knight to d3, hitting the queen and the rook on the e1 square. And the point is, Anish Giri is up so much material. He's up 3 minor pieces way back in this position. He can afford to give up his useless queen on b8 that's doing nothing to kill off the key attacking piece here. Of course, white is threatening knight g6. That would lead to very dangerous ideas. Therefore, here, Anish Giri, the counter queen sacrifice, that deserves 10 exclamation points. An absolutely brilliant move by Anish Giri. Now we have queen takes, then knight d3. The knight jumps in, forks the queen and the rook. Hans, queen to g5. He slides over, tries to continue the attack, but now Anish, knight to h7. And look at this, Anish with the mini fortress of all the pieces. The only vulnerable point here in the Anish Giri fortress is that knight on h7. But how can Hans attack it? The only way would be perhaps rook to e3, to g3, to g4, to h4, to queen to h5, and then take. He does not have time for that. And therefore, Anish, his little mini fortress is going to hold, and he's going to win with his massive material advantage. The queen's got to move, and then you take the rook on the e1 square. For example, queen to h4 played in the game, and then knight takes e1. Anish Giri, let's do inventory. Both sides have a rook. Let's exclude that. That means Hans has the queen versus the knight, the bishop, the rook, and the knight. Anish Giri has too much material. Here, Hans, he takes on g7. The rook takes back, the king takes back. Queen to e7 hits the king. King to h8. And now Hans has one queen versus the 2 rooks, the 3 minor pieces. What is he doing? He takes on c4. Hans does have a lot of pawns here, but it's too little, too late. Anish Giri, knight to f3. The point being, the king on g1, it is pinned by the rook. You can't take on f3 with the pawn. That would not work. So king to f1, and Anish Giri, knight to d2, forks the king, and these 2 pawns right here. Anish will win back even more material, and in this position, Hans Niemann, he resigns on the spot to Anish Giri. This guy knows when he is beat. He knows when he's been gotten, and he simply could not pull through in this game despite the overwhelming advantage. But Anish Giri, I mean, hats off to this guy. The counter queen sacrifice in response to Hans Niemann's triple minor piece sacrifice. Wow, what a game. That is truly the game of the year. And keep in mind, these guys just played this game as I'm recording this video. It is today on, let's see, June 4th. It'll be June 5th when the video goes live. Very impressive stuff. All right, guys, that is all for today. Feel free to comment down below what you think of Hans Niemann and this game in particular, but also Hans Niemann in general. Do you like Hans? Do you hate Hans? Personally, I like the guy, but whatever you feel about Hans, feel free to just vent and post it down below. I'd love to hear your true thoughts on Hans Niemann right here. And while you're at it, go and smash that YouTube like button to help support the channel. And beyond that, I wish you the best of luck in your chess improvement journey in 2025 and beyond. And I'll see you in the next video.